Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about seam allowance and their whole meaning when it comes to garment construction. In this video, I want people to know proper knowledge and the technical terms of a seam and seam allowances, especially if you want to learn how to make your own clothes. Now, what is a seam? A seam in a garment is a line, as you can see here, is a line that divides two pieces of fabric sewn together to create a clothing piece. Here's a full definition of a seam allowance. The seam allowance is the area between the raw edge of the fabric and the stitching line, as I previously explained. The seam allowance protects the stitches from pulling away from the seam. Seams are essential because it creates the shape required for the garment to contour to the bust area, the waist, and the hips, especially in the female form to flatter her figure. As you can see in the illustration and the picture, the stitching line helps protect the weaving of the fabric from pulling apart or fraying. So over time, the garment doesn't fall apart and it makes the garment ultimately to be more durable. Now, there are several seams that you need to learn about or that you probably heard of. Let me show you. Open seam is a seam allowance that is open, making it more flexible for alterations. The open seam is also the most basic seam that you can start with when you are learning how to make clothes and how to make seams on a garment. Closed seam. When it comes to closed seam, the seam allowance is closed, making it more economical for mass production. This type of stitch line is using knits. As you can see on the illustration to the left, the stitching line at the edge of the fabric is called the serger stitch. A lot of garments that have a closed seam mostly contain the serger stitch, and this allows the garment to be more durable and for, as I explained earlier, the weaving on the textile on the fabric doesn't fray or fall apart. Side seams. So side seams is a stitch line that runs down in a vertical line in a garment. In this picture, you can see here that the stitch line starts at the armhole or the bottom of the sleeves, running down in a vertical line to the hemline of a shirt. Structural seams. So structural seams are located at the shoulder seam, side seam, sleeves on the arm seams to help the garment create shape and silhouette. So whenever you see a seam at the shoulder, uh, at the side seam, you see a the seam and any other area of the body that helps create a definitive shape that is also called a structural seam. Enclosed seam. So enclosed seam, they are located at the edges of collars, some pockets, side seams in jeans, waistline, and cuff edges. Here in both pictures, you can see here that there are no frays, no raw edges of fabric showing up. Uh, all the seams that you can see on both pictures in the garment are enclosed. The stitching line is perfectly finished on both garments. um, both pictures are showing on the bottom top stitch hemline, which is not showing any raw edges, and the picture to the right is showing a French seam, um, well done, with no edges showing as well. Now, there's also something more important that you need to know about seam allowances. The distance area between the edge of the fabric and the stitching line will depend on what type of fabric you will use to make that garment. And to know the type of fabric that you will need to make that type of garment, you need to know the thickness and the thinness of the fabric. In the professional way to call the thickness and the thinness of the fabric is called fabric weight. Here's the three different fabric weights that you will use according to the thickness and thinness of the fabric you will need in the seam allowance. Let's start with lightweight fabrics. There's lightweight fabrics such as sheer fabrics, chiffon, tulle, organza, veil, lace, linen, cotton, silk, synthetic fabric, and blends such as polyester, rayon, and satin. Medium weight fabrics, they are um, they are the fabrics that are typically 150 to 350 GSM, such as linen, denim, knits, nylon, polyester, velvet, wool, suede, and satin. And lastly, heavyweight fabrics such as canvas, denim, corduroy, tweed, wool, fleece, brocade, jacquard, gabardine, chenille, moleskin, burlap, etc. Always check the stitch tension on the sewing machine and make sure that you are using the correct tension. Do not continue if the tension is incorrect. The stitch cannot be too tight or too loose either. Please make sure you are using high quality fabrics to sew your garments. The stitching process and the sewing process will be easier for you if you are using high quality fabrics. Also, make sure you are using pins or you stay stitch your fabric pieces before sewing the seam allowance. So now there are several seam allowance lengths that you should know about according to which fabric weight you will be using. I have here a lightweight sheer fabric. As you can see at the edge of the fabric, there are two stitch lines, okay? One of the stitch line, the closest to the raw edge, this is 1/4 inch seam allowance, as you can see here. When it comes to lightweight sheer fabrics, they are very delicate fabrics to work with. So depending on which type of stitching you will use to finish the seam allowance, you can either start with 1/4 inch seam allowance or 1/2 inch seam allowance, as you can see here in the stitch line. This is another lightweight, and this is quite heavier because this is another a different type of fabric, but also under the range of lightweight fabrics. The seam allowance on this fabric is 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch seam allowance, industry wise, is the most standard, the most commonly used seam allowance length to use uh, for seam allowance, to create a fabric. This is the seam allowance length that I learned to use back in fashion school. And for anybody learning how to sew garments and you are a beginner, this is the most convenient one, the most convenient seam allowance length that you can start with, 1/2 inch seam allowance. Also, for medium weight seam allowance, you can also start with 1/2 inch seam allowance. It won't hurt if you always start with 1/2 inch seam allowance. And lastly, heavyweight seam allowance. I have here 12 fabric. This is 12 cotton heavyweight. You can always start with 1/2 inch seam allowance, or uh, I would say the more professionally length that you can start with will be half, not half, 5/8. 5/8 half an inch to 5/8 seam allowance. The distance, not the distance. If you don't really know how to figure out the seam allowance of 5/8, 5/8 is between half an inch and 3/4 seam allowance on your sewing machine. Your sewing machine has an indicator at the foot once you place the fabric to start sewing of how much seam allowance you want to start with. So on the footing area, you can always place the fabric. If you want to start with 5/8, you can always place the fabric in between a little over half an inch, but not getting too close to 3/4. And that will be anything in between that will be 5/8. Now I have here denim. This is one of the sturdier, uh, heavyweight fabrics out there. So for denim, denim is more tricky to work with. Um, when it comes to like sewing, I always start with 3/4. As you can see here, you can either start with 3/4 or you can start with 1 inch seam allowance. What depending on what type of project you want to start with using denim fabric. If I were you, I would always start with either 3/4 of an inch seam allowance or 1 inch seam allowance. 1 inch seam allowance allows you to trim some seam allowance if you are using a different type of finishing on the stitch line, the raw edge of the fabric, or if you are using the serger stitch, which is easier to use, you can always leave some space and start with 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. Regardless of which type of fabric weight you are using, I always see people on social media starting from the littlest, the smallest seam allowance of a 1/4 inch, or sometimes even 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, to all the way to 3/4 of an inch seam allowance uh, as a start to sew garments and any other items, depending on the fabric weight they're using. That will depend on you and the type of project that you are going to start with. um, Industry wise, the best way that you can learn how to sew a garment, or how to start sewing any project, any sewing project that you start with, ideally I would suggest anybody to start with half an inch seam allowance. And as you sew more and you practice more and you get the hang of it, you would eventually become an expert of your own projects and decide in the future which seam allowance length works for you depending on the fabric weight of the fabric that you are using. As a sustainable fashion designer, I don't advise anybody to use the serger stitch on lightweight woven fabrics. I'm not saying to not use the serger stitch on any fabrics. I'm saying I don't advise anybody to use the serger stitch on lightweight woven fabrics. Why am I saying this? Because if you are sewing a garment that does not require lining, such as a blouse or shirt or pants, why are you using the serger stitch when you can use a different sewing technique? I don't know. Maybe use French seam, maybe use Hong Kong finish, maybe use flat felt stitching, maybe use piping. But there's no necessary to use the serger stitch on woven lightweight fabrics. So please, if you want to use the serger stitch on heavyweight and medium weight fabrics, you can still use another sewing technique, but please don't use it on lightweight woven fabrics. Let's leave the serger stitch for knits, not lightweight wovens. Let's, if you are thinking about solar punk, if you want to be more sustainable with your clothes, if you don't want to wear synthetic fabrics anymore, if you are only interested in buying or working with cellulosic fabrics such as linen, which have different weights, but if you want to work with lightweight linen to create a blouse, please don't think about the serger stitch. Use a different sewing techniques. They are out there. You can research. You will find them. There's a bunch of people and women on YouTube giving tutorials on how to use different sewing techniques on lightweight fabrics, except for the serger stitch. Thank you for watching my video. I hope that you learn about seam allowances and how you can work with seam allowances in general. I am a sustainable fashion designer. Here on YouTube, I post videos occasionally about sustainable fashion news, slow fashion, and fashion technology. If you have any questions about this video, this topic of seam allowances, you can let me know down below. I appreciate if you post any other opinions about sewing in general. I would love to see those comments and share my thoughts if I can. And thank you for watching, and I'll be posting more. Bye.